Police move in on the 2-week-long encampment at George Washington University, clearing out the protesters. We're on campus with more on what we can expect next. Temps are heating up today, but more storms are headed our way tomorrow.
Frustratingly high interest rates won't budge immediately after last week's decision by the Fed to keep them on the same path. One credit card expert tells me 5 ways to crawl out of the hole of debt and navigate a world of steep costs.
We have tips in time for Mother's Day this weekend. Everything from special brunch plans to different gift ideas. Hear from shocked neighbors who say bears are getting too close for comfort. More on the increased bear sightings.
You're watching the station covering all of the DMV. This is DC News Now.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the news at noon. I'm Shanika Grimshaw in for Mark Hall. We're following developing news in D.C. After nearly 2 weeks, police overnight cleared the protest encampments on George Washington's campus. Now, this was the scene. This right there was the scene this morning, and as you can see, police deploying pepper spray into the crowd. At least 33 demonstrators were arrested, some already released. It comes as D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser and Police Chief Pamela Smith were set to testify this afternoon on Capitol Hill as to why they had not yet taken on campus. So that is where we find our DC News Now's Randy Bass. Randy, it's been about 8 hours. I've been here all morning since D.C. officers first moved in.
Yeah, Shanika, we're here at the police facility in Southwest D.C. where those protesters were released earlier this morning. 33 of them arrested earlier today as police moved into that encampment. Some of them were still here and just left in the last few moments as we started to set up here to bring you this live report. We're going back now to that video, that incredible video we shot this morning of those very moments that police moved in to that encampment. Very strong visuals we're seeing here out of the GW campus today as those officers moved in and shut that encampment down. This morning, Police Chief Pamela Smith said officials gave the demonstrators warnings and clear directions 6 times, and those who did not comply were arrested. Some of those protesters were pepper sprayed by police. Officials say the pepper spray was in response to an assault on an officer, though 3 people were arrested for assaults on officers and 30 more were arrested for trespassing. Chief Smith said the decision to move in was made earlier this week. They were trying not to infringe on First Amendment activity, but say it became a matter of public safety there after police heard about weapons at the encampment and assaults on pro-Israel protesters. Take a listen.
Our plan included giving warnings, multiple warnings, and clear direction to people inside the encampment to disperse the area. We allowed protesters ample time to leave the area. In total, there were 6 dispersal announcements before our officers took action. Many complied and left the encampment area. Those who did not comply were arrested.
Yes, and as for what's next, the student protesters, many of them who just left here, are heading now downtown to the Wilson Building, where some of those student protesters, many of whom were arrested this morning, are planning to hold a press conference and update on their future plans. That is set to happen at the Wilson Building this afternoon at 1 p.m. We'll bring you the very latest details from that press conference as we get them. Live in Southwest, I'm Randy Bass, DC News Now.
All right, thank you for those updates, Randy. Now meteorologist Damon Matson joins us with the latest check on the forecast. It's going to be an extremely hot day today in the DMV.
Yeah, Shanika, we've been just going back and forth with our temperatures, and on these days where we see them soar, it definitely feels like it's on the hot side of things, but we're going to be there for sure. Now, to start out the day, we have had plenty of clouds crossing the DMV, and in a way that has prevented us from warming up quickly through the morning time. So we have not quite reached that hot stage yet with our temperatures. However, these clouds, they are starting to break up a little bit as we progress into the early afternoon. The exception to that would be over northern Virginia, and where we see the clouds really start to break up, that's where the temperatures are going to really jump from the upper 70s and lower 80s where we're at now, well into the upper 80s, potentially lower 90s by later this afternoon around 3 to 4 o'clock. There's that clearing I was mentioning, going from a mostly cloudy sky to a more partly cloudy sky before the day is done. So no question, we are building up the heat out there, and we're getting some energy built up in the atmosphere as a storm system will then approach later tonight, going into Thursday from the west. And as it does so, it will encounter a favorable environment for the potential of some severe weather on our Thursday. The yellow here indicating that level 2 out of 5 risk that is still in place primarily across the eastern half of the DMV, including the I-95 corridor and the DC Metro tomorrow. So when should we expect some of these storms to develop, and what are the primary threats from any severe storms that do end up moving through the area? We'll have a full look at your forecast coming up here in just a bit.
All right, Damon, thank you. 12:05 in Maryland, Governor Wes Moore will meet with lawmakers this afternoon to discuss federal support for rebuilding the Key Bridge. This comes as divers find the remains of 37-year-old Jose Minor Lopez yesterday. He's the last worker recovered. 6 construction workers died in the collapse, and 2 other workers were rescued the morning of the collapse. Demolition crews are now preparing to use explosives to help break down the largest remaining piece of the bridge. The hope is to reopen the port's main channel by end of May. And in the district, 1 person is now in police custody accused of killing a well-known rapper in D.C. Philip Prendergast, also known as Phil the Future, was shot and killed during an armed robbery at a marijuana dispensary in March. This here is the surveillance video you're looking at showing 2 men with guns. D.C. police also arrested 21-year-old Trenton Collins for murder. And now take a look at this. Police released a photo of the second suspect in this case, who they're still looking for. MPD offering a $25,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. A Prince George's County police officer is facing charges after being arrested in Charles County. PGPD says Officer Charles William Jr. was arrested yesterday and is now suspended with pay. He's accused of assaulting a Charles County sheriff's deputy. Officials say that deputy was responding to a domestic dispute at Williams' home at the time. The deputy was not hurt. And drivers in Alexandria will see increased police presence this afternoon. It's part of the ongoing Street Smart campaign to reduce pedestrian and bicyclist deaths. Police are ticketing traffic violations at the intersection of North Jordan and Duke Street. Fines can cost up to $500, and you can get points on your license. And for drivers, some of the best ways to stay safe is to obey the speed limit and be careful when passing buses or stopped vehicles. Pedestrians should always cross the street at marked crosswalks and wait for the signal to cross. And as for those on bikes, they should never ride against traffic and use hand signals to communicate your intentions with drivers. And in Frederick County, Maryland, school district leaders are planning to cut funding for charter schools. They're proposing to cut 10% of funding. DC News Now spoke to Board of Trustees president for Montessori Public Charter Schools. She says the cuts could mean the end of charter schools, and she's asking leaders to give them a 1-year freeze.
Give us all some breathing room to kind of figure out how this impacts our programming and make some, I'd say, educated decisions on what we need to do moving forward.
DC News Now reached out to FCPS for a statement, but didn't get a response just yet. And in North Potomac, a petition gaining thousands of signatures as neighbors fight to keep the Potomac Horse Center open. The center announced last week they're closing in July. They say it's because of failed negotiations with Maryland National Capital Parks.
It means so much to them, just knowing that a place like this exists for therapy riding, for camps, for lessons, the open houses that they have, just brings so much richness to the community.
We reached out to MNC PC on the future of the farm. They have not yet responded. And millions of Americans now owing more than $1 trillion after credit card debt hit a record high late last year. DC News Now's weekend anchor Ben Dennis is stretching your dollar to deal with that debt, especially for those living paycheck to paycheck.
Frustratingly high interest rates will not budge immediately after last week's decision by the Fed. And one credit card expert tells me that there are 5 ways to crawl out of that hole of debt if you're living paycheck to paycheck, navigating a world of high interest rates. Paycheck to paycheck, staring down credit card debt. Why is that interest rate so high?
It's riskier for lenders to lend you unsecured debt, than it is for them to lend you money that's tied to something important that you own.
And that's why interest rates soar compared to loans for cars and homes. Average credit card interest rate today, well over 20%. So, how to pay that down?
First, call the number on the back of your credit card and see if you'd be eligible for a lower interest rate.
Zoom in on your current spending.
There might be some secret money vampires going on that's whisking money out of your bank account without you knowing. Are there any subscriptions you're still paying for that you don't actually use? Are your grocery bills higher than expected because you're buying a lot of things that are not on your list? Are you eating out more often than you want to?
If there's already no wiggle room, consider how to bring in extra cash.
Whether that's through a side hustle, freelance work, or even a different job. That's easier said than done. But
afterward, get your interest rate down elsewhere.
Things like balance transfer credit cards come into play. These types of cards allow you to move credit card debt from a card that charges a higher interest rate to a card that has a 0% promotional interest rate for a set period of time.
Money management websites aggregate data about these cards. Consider not just picking from one website's list of suggestions. Shop around. And balance transfer cards typically do require good credit when you apply for them. The fifth and final way to deal with that credit card debt, we're told, consider a personal loan, but there won't be a 0% promotional interest rate period. You will have a lower interest rate rather. Just be sure to pay off that loan on time to avoid any penalties. Ben Dennis, DC News Now.
Israeli troops have seized control of Rafah, the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. Now Israel's government is threatening a wider offensive in the southern territory. On Monday, Hamas says it accepted an Egypt-Qatar ceasefire proposal, but Israel says the deal did not meet its core demands.